Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I'm in front of a number of good friends that I've had the honor of addressing a few times during COVID shutdown, and I hope you enjoy. This is the final talk, so we're almost done. Hang in there. When they asked me to give a talk about the future of psychopharmacology, I went through my notes and realized that I had given a similar talk about 3 or 4 years ago. And when I looked at those slides, I couldn't believe how much things have changed. A few years ago, there was very little innovation in psychopharmacology. Many of the big companies had abandoned that. And the outlook was a little grim in terms of new drugs. The outlook was mostly good for neuroscience. Well, already in just a few years, that's changed. And so we're going to talk about new concepts in neurobiology and new treatments that are on the horizon. Are you ready? So, what's going on in our field? First of all, innovation is shifting. And we used to target psychiatric disorders as defined in DSM and ICD. That's no longer the case. We are increasingly targeting the symptoms of the disorders, but not the disorders themselves. I don't know about you, but I don't treat major depressive disorder. I don't treat schizophrenia. I treat delusions. I treat hallucinations. I treat sadness. I treat guilt. So the reality is that we've always treated this way, but now we are deconstructing the diagnosis into the symptoms. The molecular targets of new drugs used to be monoamine neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, over and over and over again. And it's no longer true. What is the target? It's the nodes of the network. In other words, we are now talking not so much about, say, neurotransmitter in the brain or a serotonin receptor in the brain. It's not what neurotransmitter or what receptor, it's where neurotransmitter and where receptor. Because we think that each network regulates a different symptom. So you have to target the network that controls the symptoms. And the network is just a bunch of nerves connected to each other, and every place they connect is called a node. The whole thing is called a network. It's a little bit like, electronics or wiring. And these nodes are being targeted not only by the classical monoamines, but increasingly by novel neurotransmitters and their receptors. So we'll get to that at the end. So we've gone from psychiatric disorders as drug targets to psychiatric symptoms as drug targets. And what do we do about that? Well, we have the idea that psychiatric disorders are syndromes. They're collections of symptoms defined by experts, but not neurobiologically. It's defined by a committee, the DSM or the ICD. And these syndromes are heterogeneous. If you've ever treated patients with depression, you know they're not all the same. Schizophrenia, they're not all the same. Their symptoms hypothetically arise from inefficient information processing in different brain circuits, but not everybody is the same. Some people have some symptoms and some people have other symptoms. We know that the brain is therefore topographically diverse. What does that mean? It means that one area of the brain takes care of one set of symptoms, and another area of the brain takes care of other symptoms. And furthermore, those symptoms cut across many psychiatric disorders. They travel. Psychosis, schizophrenia, you can be psychotic and depressed, you can be psychotic and manic, etc. Pain, cognition is a very big one. Lots of different disorders have a cognitive problem. Insomnia, lots of disorders. So increasingly, we're targeting things like these symptoms, not the disorders. Because psychiatric disorders are categorical. We're talking not categories anymore, but dimensions. And I'll show you a little picture of that in just a minute. Psychiatric disorders are collections of symptoms chosen by some famous committee, but they don't know anything about the brain. Psychiatric disorders are revised periodically. There's the DSM-5. Someday there'll be the DSM-6. They're descriptive, and they're useful for us to talk about things, because that means when I say schizophrenia, you know what I'm talking about, because we have a standard definition. But they're not very good for neurobiology, and they certainly don't predict treatment response. Just because you have schizophrenia doesn't mean you're going to respond well to an antipsychotic. Because psychiatric disorders are not diseases. They're syndromes put together by a committee. So we've moved from diseases to disorders to symptoms, and now we're going to go from molecular targets to circuits as the target. So basically, we now know that each psychiatric disorder has many diseases, maybe hundreds of diseases. How many forms of depression are there? One? I don't think so. Psychiatric symptoms correlate somewhat with their malfunctioning brain circuits, but they don't correlate very well with genes or other biomarkers yet. Brain circuits are the best correlation so far. So the current diagnostic strategy is to try to link symptoms that cut across psychiatric disorders to inefficient information processing in a specific brain circuit. Why? Because if you can fix that symptom and that circuit in one psychiatric disorder, you should be able to fix that symptom in that circuit in any psychiatric disorder. So, what is it looking like? We have depressed mood, that's a symptom. Apathy or loss of interest, that's a symptom. Problems concentrating, that's a symptom. Insomnia, what disorder is that? I'll come back in a minute. What about if you have anxiety and worry, irritability, problems concentrating, and insomnia? What disorder is that? And finally, what if you have inattention and impulsivity and problems concentrating and hyperactivity? Well, if you are thinking clearly, this one is major depressive disorder. If you go down, that's a category. If you go down in the middle, that's GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. And on the right, that's ADHD. That's the old-fashioned categorical way of doing it. But that's not how the brain works. There's no brain circuit for major depressive disorder. But, for example, there is a brain circuit for problems concentrating, and that goes across from left to right. That is an example of a symptom that exists in many places. And all those, in fact, problems of sleep disorders have this, narcolepsy has this. So problems concentrating is going to be mapped to a specific brain circuit. And when we can figure out how to improve that circuit's functioning, we can fix problems concentrating everywhere, bipolar, whatever. So we now have called the psychosis network. I'm going to give you a few examples of how innovation in the future is going to work. We're not going to look at schizophrenia. We're going to look, let's say in this case, about the positive symptoms of psychosis, which exist in many disorders. And what we're going to do is go beyond dopamine. For 60 years, we've had dopamine and the so-called mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which is hyperactive. If you haven't been asleep for the last 50 years, you know that's the hypothesis. But now we've moved away from this and expanded to the psychosis network. So here's the old part of it. We're going to rename that. Dopamine is now a node in the psychosis network. And the VTA, ventral tegmental area, to the ventral striatum is the mesolimbic pathway. And you know what we do to treat when this is too high? You can do PET scans and prove that too much dopamine is coming out of this presynaptic nerve terminal in schizophrenia, in mania, in many kinds of psychosis. So we block over here all the D2 receptors to block all that dopamine that's coming out. That's been done for 50 or 60 years. Now we're going to change all that, because watch this. This node is in a network of this. Oh my goodness. And now we've got other things. We've got a glutamate node that's talking to the dopamine node. We've got a GABA and a serotonin node talking to the glutamate node. So this is going around and around and around. And it turns out that's important, because you don't just have to treat this person by blocking the dopamine circuit. Theoretically, if you had the right drug, you could work here at the glutamate node, or the GABA node, or the serotonin node. And we already know that new treatments are coming already from the serotonin node. And then one of the good examples of that is Parkinson's disease psychosis. In that disorder, of course, dopamine dies in the nigrostriatal pathway, but did you know that this serotonin neuron gets Lewy bodies also, and it dies, and serotonin levels go down? And then what happens is that these 5-HT2A receptors that live on glutamate neurons upregulate. This creates an imbalance. Too much serotonin, because these are excitatory. So one of the things we found out is if we blocked these, you would reverse the visual hallucinations and the auditory hallucinations and delusions associated with Parkinson's psychosis. You can still block over here the D2 receptors, but what does that do in Parkinson's disease? Pretty bad. It makes motor problems. It's not tolerated, so you can't do it. What if you block these guys? And in fact, that's what happens. You can block the 5-HT2A receptors. This will decrease glutamate, which will stop the dopamine release. Dopamine's being blocked, but not directly. It's being blocked upstream. You may not know this, but dementia-related psychosis, whether that's from Lewy bodies of Parkinson's disease, plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's, fibrils of various types of tau and everything else, and infarcts, even from stroke, if they wipe out this GABA neuron, which does seem to happen, guess what happens? There's a GABA deficiency, and these neurons in some patients are overstimulated, and that gives you not enough inhibition, too much excitation, visual hallucinations, and here. So how do you treat that? Well, you could give a D2 antagonist, but if you do that in dementia, what happens? The patient dies. It's toxic. You can't do that. It's contraindicated. So let's go upstream and block these 5-HT2A receptors, and indeed you can show that it works. So there are a number of theories. The dopamine theory, glutamate is thought to be abnormal in neurodevelopment in schizophrenia to cause schizophrenia upstream. Serotonin theory. So now you've got 3 theories of psychosis, 3 nodes in the network, and at least 2 of them you can get treatments. And in the future, we expect them to come from glutamate, but we don't have them today. But I'm not done. There's another node. Oh my God, I'm getting a headache. Too many nodes. No, it's great because there's more ways to treat psychosis. So you've seen this. Let me add a new one. Are you aware that there's an acetylcholine node? Oh my goodness. And when you stimulate M4 receptors with a new drug that's just been in study, you will reduce psychosis. Wow. Cholinergic treatment of psychosis. Another node in the network. And hold on to your hat. The last one is here. There's a trace amine associated part of the network. And a new trace amine receptor type 1 agonist is a new antipsychotic. Whoa, because it's a new node in the network. So not only do you have dopamine for 50 years and recently glutamate, and I just told you about serotonin, now you've got 2 more trace amines and cholinergic. Whoa, That should blow your mind. And it's all based on the underlying theory that symptoms, let's say in this case of psychosis, are in a network or a circuit, and any place that you can act on that circuit, any node that connects any two neurons, is a potential therapeutic site. So it gives us new chances to treat psychosis. And this principle, I don't have enough time to do it, is true for everything in psychiatry right now. Briefly, I'll talk about a mood network, but not extensively, but you get the idea. And so in the mood network, you've got depressed mood, worthlessness, guilt is in this part of the brain, suicidal ideation in a different part, fatigue. So we are mapping the symptoms of major depressive disorder to different brain areas. And you have to treat the circuit of each of these symptoms if you want to improve the symptom. There's no one circuit for major depression. Look at all these different symptoms. They each have a different network, And there are nodes. You know, you and I were very lucky. For another 50 years in depression, it turned out that serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine were very important nodes in the mood network. And for 50 years, we've been beating that circuit to death with drugs that boost dopamine, norepinephrine, or serotonin, right? Hey, I got a question for you. Do you have some patients that don't respond to those drugs that hit those neurotransmitters? Yes. So maybe you need to go to a different node in the network. And fortunately, we have two that we know quite well. The glutamate node in the mood network and the neuroactive steroid node. Another way to talk about neuroactive steroids is to say that they target GABA A receptors, but a specific type. You're used to benzodiazepines targeting GABA A receptors, but these are different ones. These are not targeted by benzodiazepine, and they're extrasynaptic. The ones for benzos are intrasynaptic. So two new ways to go after depression. I don't have time, but I'm just telling you where the future is. You've heard of this, I'm sure. RS-ketamine is the IV. S-ketamine is the intranasal form. And what you have is a glutamate neuron talking to a GABA neuron talking to a third neuron, which is glutamate. And we think the connection between them gets blocked by ketamine, and ketamine then prevents the glutamate from the first nerve to actually stimulate this guy here. And when that occurs, the third guy has a burst of glutamate that comes out. And that burst of glutamate is related to downstream trophic factors. And so one of the final common pathways, everything that treats depression, whether it's monoamines, glutamate, or neuroactive steroids, probably has a final common pathway of improving trophic factors in the brain. So you can make spines grow 20 minutes after a ketamine infusion because of glutamate burst. You can also do that with GABA stimulation, which is inhibitory, right? But of a new receptor. The intrasynaptic receptors that are benzo-sensitive are not the target. The neuroactive steroids like SAGE-217 or allopregnanolone, which is now approved for postpartum depression in the United States, and the oral version is in late-stage clinical depression testing, is targeting this guy over here, which actually is modified by a neuroactive steroid, which is what this is. Wow. So I hope I've teased you, I've provoked you, I've excited you, because the future is great in psychopharmacology. But innovation is moving away from targeting disorders to targeting symptoms. Also, symptoms are not thought to be caused by simple chemical imbalances. Instead, they're thought to be caused by inefficient information processing, each symptom in a specific different brain network. or circuit. And these symptoms can be relieved by targeting any node in that network. So if you figure out the network, you can go after it by a new node. It gives you all sorts of new innovation and new targeting and new drugs possibility. This is currently leading to breakthroughs in the treatment of psychosis without even targeting dopamine directly. And it's also breakthroughs in the treatment of mood without targeting monoamines. So the future is great. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm happy to have some questions now.